please let me welcome you all to this fall 2023 Salem State Psychology Colloquium. I'm Sophie Evett. I'm a faculty member in the psychology department for 25 years. And today is a collaborative effort with Dr. Andrea Zarin, waving over there, who has really stepped up these last several weeks to make sure we had an awesome event. So we have her to thank for the extensive publicity you may have seen around campus, the food, which is amazing. If you didn't get some before the talk, please get some after, and myriad other details. So I want to extend a particular moment of gratitude to Dr. Zarin, who actually was the one who recommended that we bring Dr. Clayton here today. So thank you, Dr. Zarin. I also want to thank the university for its continued support of the Psychology Colloquium, supporting this great tradition. I'll tell you a little bit more about it in a minute. And a special shout out to our sustainability coordinator, Tara Gallagher, and Earth Days for their additional support as well. So. And I want to welcome all the people who are here in this room, but I also want to welcome folks that are logging in on the webinar. And we are going to have a Q&A at the end of Dr. Clayton's talk. If you are on the webinar, there's a link that you can click on to ask questions, and I'll be monitoring that laptop afterwards to see if we have any questions from our webinar guests. So feel free to contribute in that way. Obviously, the people in the room, you could raise your hand and we will hear from you that way. The Psychology Colloquium series has been a tradition in our department for over 35 years. Originally established and nurtured by our professor emerita, Dr. Marcia Weinstein. Over the years, we've had influential researchers such as Howard Gardner, Ellen Langer, Lisa Feldman Barrett, Melba Vasquez, just to name a few. And they have come to speak to our community on a variety of topics such as trauma, suicide prevention, moral judgment and decision making, the social media impacts on teens, just to name a few. It's been our tradition to select speakers that help us to understand current and significant challenges and opportunities that we face in the world. Today, we face a challenge like no other, that of the global climate change crisis. While many other issues demand attention and action, the climate crisis is on a particularly short and demanding timeline. Action is required now to prevent catastrophic consequences globally. And while there is no doubt that actions are happening and the world is paying attention, there is still much to do in the next year, the next 5, the next 10 years to help avert some of the worst outcomes and to prepare for the outcomes that we will face. Such an existential threat is daunting and has particularly impacted the well-being of people across the world, in particular young people. And it's this threat that has captured the attention of our esteemed guest today, Dr. Susan Clayton of the College of Wooster in Wooster, Ohio. Dr. Clayton is the Whitmore Williams Professor and Department Chair of Psychology and serves as liaison to the Environmental Communication and Action Pathway. Dr. Clayton is a conservation psychologist who has long been interested in the interaction of humans and the natural world and in promoting healthy relationships between humans and nature. She earned her Ph.D. in social psychology at Yale University and has received many accolades and awards. She has served as a fellow of the American Psychological Association and the International Association of Applied Psychology, and she received the Distinguished Service Award from the Society for the Psychological Study of Social Issues. She has authored and edited several books, including a recent book on the psychology of climate change, and her global impact became undeniable when she served as a lead author on the 2022 Sixth Assessment Report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, which is the United Nations body assessing the science related to climate change. Dr. Clayton has conducted extensive research and authored dozens of papers and presentations on the impacts of climate change on psychological well-being, including the development of a scale to assess climate anxiety. Her work highlights the significant toll this issue and the role of government and corporate inaction is playing on the hearts and minds of people across the world, particularly youth and young adults. But she also addresses the way forward, how hope can trigger action, and the need for resilience as we face this daunting challenge to humanity. So today, we are honored to have this esteemed researcher share her work and understanding of these important issues with us. So let's give a warm Salem State welcome to our guest, Dr. Susan Clayton.
Great, thanks so much. It's really a privilege to be part of this distinguished colloquium series and a pleasure to be in this part of the country, which I really like. And the weather is nice, and I appreciate the fact that you're all coming to hear me, and I hope this isn't too depressing a topic. Obviously, it's an important one and one we need to be paying attention to. So you all know the answer to this question, I think, but for years, it's been a struggle to get many psychologists to think about why they have a role to play in addressing climate change, and also a struggle to get other people to recognize why psychologists have a part to play. So my first answer to this question is that climate change is happening. This is a very recent quote, September 20th. Humanity has opened the gates to hell, a kind of scary quote. But climate change is happening. We know it's happening, and we know it's something we need to pay attention to. And we know that there is a wide range of negative impacts associated with climate change. And I was just talking with a few of you about how our understanding of this has changed in what seems to some of us like the relatively recent past, like 5 years ago, certainly 10 years ago. People were mostly thinking about climate change as something that maybe, was affecting polar bears. When you thought about climate change, you thought about melting ice flows and so on. We are, I think, increasingly aware of the ways in which humans are being negatively impacted. So certainly a loss of biodiversity, which some of you may recognize affects humans, but also damaged or destroyed infrastructure. Many of you may have experienced some of the impacts of major storms on houses, highways, et cetera, economic impacts, and threats to human health. And among those threats to health include threats to mental health. So the goals of psychology are really relevant to the project of thinking about climate change and trying to do something about climate change. Because what psychologists do, in part, is to try and understand what contributes to psychological well-being, mental well-being, and the flip side of that, mental distress, and hopefully promoting healthy human behavior, healthy psychological state. So here's what we think about when we think about climate change these days. And these are headlines you could probably recognize from this year. We had the hottest month ever recorded, which was July. We had the hottest June on record. I'm pretty sure it was the hottest August, at least some places. I haven't seen data for September yet, but this headline, "Searing Heat with No Sign of Relief," was pretty much the story of the summer. So we're very aware of the current phenomenon of climate change. And it does have human consequences. So already, extreme weather events, and this is the term that's being used these days as opposed to natural disaster, because it's been argued that they're not really natural these days. But extreme weather events, major storms, and so on, have displaced about 20 million people each year worldwide. 500,000 have been killed by climate-related events in the past 20 years. A third of Americans have personally been affected, and 90% of American counties have experienced a climate disaster in the last 10 years. So it's definitely something that's not just affecting a small proportion of people, but a large proportion, and in some cases, as a majority. And we know that there are mental health impacts of these extreme weather events. Because even before people were talking about climate change, of course, there have been extreme weather events, there have been storms. So we've had lots of time to start gathering data and very good evidence that following an extreme weather event like a major storm, you see increases in post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, anxiety, suicide, substance abuse, interpersonal violence, which may be something that is not quite as apparent, sleep disorders. And of course, if you're having trouble sleeping, that's going to impair your immune system. So although I'm focusing on mental health impacts, they can't be separated from physical health impacts completely either. So just thinking about the experience of living through a kind of storm, you can imagine how it's traumatizing, stressful, leads to upheaval, leads to disruption in social networks. So all of that's associated with threats to mental health. And just some specific examples that, again, recent memory you probably can call to mind. We know that the rate of post-traumatic stress disorder doubled following Hurricane Maria. Suicide went up by 18%. Statistically significant increases in the use of medication and the use of mental health services in general. The Camp Fire in California, and I think we're really mindful about wildfires these days. This is a very recent study. The tripling in the rate of post-traumatic stress disorder, doubling in the rate of anxiety and depression. And this was predicted by pre-existing trauma. So a reminder that not everybody is equally affected by these experiences. Also by people who are having trouble sleeping. So sleep is an important issue. And when it's disrupted, that can contribute to more serious mental health problems. But it was also mitigated by people who said they personally felt resilient. They had resilient capacities. So that is kind of a precursor of getting to how we can be resilient in the face of some of this. And just thinking beyond America, the bushfires in Australia just a few years ago, I'm sure we all read a little bit of the news coverage and the, how many animals were threatened, how much land was damaged. They did some pretty major surveys and found that those who had been directly exposed to the bushfires showed greater rates of all these mental health problems, depression, anxiety, substance abuse, again, greater concern and distress about climate change, and lower psychological resilience. So it really is affecting people, and it's affecting more people who are more directly impacted, who are seeing these effects more visible to them. And these impacts can last. So it's not like you're in a major storm, it's stressful, next week the stress has passed and you're back to normal. They can last, weeks, months, even years. And the Alberta wildfire of 2016, they returned a year later to measure people and found still elevated rates of mental health difficulties in the community. Overall, 38% of people reporting mental health problems, which was significantly higher than baseline rates, and particularly higher among people who were personally displaced or who saw homes that were destroyed, and also among first responders. And I think that's an important thing to remember, that the people who are helping us recover from these events are themselves at very high risk of mental health problems. But in a way, I think this is not surprising. It's very easy for us to understand why living through these kinds of experiences can have a detrimental effect on mental health. I want us to think more broadly about what mental health means and what does it mean to talk about kind of well-being. And this is something that the World Health Organization has talked about. Health is more than the absence of disease. We need to think about that at a mental health level as well. So mental health is not just the absence of mental illness, it's the ability to function, to fulfill your potential. And there's just beginning to be some evidence about how these extreme weather events can also impact cognitive functioning. Again, this was, I believe, following the Camp Fire in California. They found that people who'd been directly exposed to the wildfire were showing cognitive deficits, and they actually did some brain scans and found different patterns of activity, including hyperarousal in frontal brain regions that were responsible for executive function, suggesting that it was essentially taking more effort, taking more brain activity to perform the same task for people who had had that experience. So these extreme weather events are impairing our mental health. They're also impairing our ability to just function cognitively. And in addition to broadening the definition of mental health, I want to think, well, what is climate change really? What does that mean? Is it just extreme weather events? And of course, no. It's extreme weather events and wildfires. Again, things you get a lot of reporting on in the mainstream media. They're very visible events. We can kind of do a before-after comparison and see how people's mental health has been affected. Drought is also something you see increasingly because of climate change. Heat, I'm definitely going to say more about that. Rising sea levels, thawing permafrost, and melting glaciers. And these are important because all of these are associated with the need to migrate, with people maybe being involuntarily displaced from their traditional homes. Decreased air quality. And this too is very important at a psychological level. Decreased air quality for several reasons. One is because, what is it that contributes to climate change the most? It's the burning of fossil fuels, which tends to lead to air pollution. So there's that direct link there. Also, warmer air tends to hold more particulate matter. So the air quality is lower as the air temperature warms, and also more pollen, something that some of us may understand the gravity of. Food insecurity associated with climate change. And this is actually one of the things that the United Nations considers to be one of the biggest threats of climate change. Although there are places in the world where agriculture will benefit, like Siberia, northern Canada, on average, the sort of total amount of land that's appropriate for growing food is predicted to be less as the temperature warms. And there's evidence that at least some crops actually have less nutritional value when they're grown in warmer conditions. And that's outside my expertise. I don't really understand why it is, but it is something that's being discovered. Vector-borne diseases. I mean, we're all very aware of diseases and global pandemics. You may remember before COVID, people were getting excited about things like Zika. Around here, I think Lyme disease is a big issue. The ticks that carry Lyme disease are expanding in their range because it's getting warmer. Same thing with mosquitoes. A lot of places that never used to see mosquitoes are now seeing mosquitoes. So these are carrying diseases, so we're more exposed to those diseases. And then loss of place. I talked about people being forced to migrate when their home it no longer supports life, or is no longer an appropriate place to live. Loss of biodiversity. There's an increasing body of research that really emphasizes how important being out in nature is to our mental health. And doctors actually prescribing people to visit national parks, for example. So if we have less opportunities to experience healthy nature, that's going to affect our mental health. And then again, the infrastructure and the economic disruption. So we have to think about those indirect impacts of climate change as well. So when you start to think that, okay, it's not just big storms, it's all of these things, you can see the potential for even more negative impacts of climate change on human health. I want to particularly highlight heat for several reasons. One is when we think about, we used to talk about global warming. Rising temperatures are one of the key manifestations of climate change. This is what we're talking about at some level when we talk about climate change. Temperatures are higher. I showed you those headlines. We're all aware that temperatures are higher this year than they have been. One of the things we look at is those graphs that show the average temperature going up. So we really know that heat is part of what climate change is going to involve. It's also useful to talk about this because there's actually been quite a lot of research on heat, on the impacts of heat on psychological well-being and mental health, dating from at least the 60s, I believe. You can actually experimentally manipulate heat in a way that you can't experimentally manipulate an extreme weather event. You can put people in a room and raise the temperature and see what happens. And so we have confidence that heat has a causal impact on some things. So higher temperatures have been associated. This would not be something you would experimentally study, of course. This is something that you study through observing the correlation between suicide rates and whether a particular geographic area is experiencing unusually high temperatures. But massive data sets that have shown when places experience unusually high temperatures, say 1 or 2 standard deviations above the mean, you do see increases in suicide, you see increases in psychiatric hospitalizations. Aggression, this is something that has been experimentally observed. People are kind of more hostile to each other when the temperatures are hot. And some of the creative ways in which that's been studied or observed have been, all the things that psychologists do. You can see people are more willing to give each other shocks. You can see that drivers are quicker to honk their horns in hotter temperatures. Pitchers in baseball are more likely to hit somebody with the ball when it's hotter. So, aggression is not the only thing that's going on there, but it is one of the things. And something as simple as people just being less happy. And I think some of this research has been very creative. There have been studies that literally have millions of data points. They've been looking at posts on social media, like the platform formerly known as Twitter or Facebook, to see what do people post and do they use positive emotion terms. And on hotter days, you see fewer positive emotion terms used. So people are just not as happy. And of course, heat also affects our mental functioning and our physical functioning. So there have been stories this year in particular about impacts on outdoor workers. You may have read there are people getting up at 3 o'clock in the morning to go to do their jobs because they literally can't do them in the middle of the day. This could be agricultural workers. It could be people repairing cable lines, things like that. So heat has that direct impact on what there's an upper limit to what people can adapt to when it comes to heat. And we're not going to, we can't just get used to it. Heat also affects our interpersonal behavior. And this gets back to the idea of aggression. Again, studies not just by psychologists, by economists, finding international and intergroup conflict increases when it's hot. And people are just less nice to each other. So reduced pro-social behavior. And there's a number of hypotheses about why this might be. We have the whole aggression frustration kind of model of behavior that we don't like being hot. I should say frustration, aggression. We don't like being hot. We get frustrated because we are not comfortable and we can't get comfortable. That frustration leads to aggression. Just a physiological arousal associated with the heat. The cognitive impacts. So we know that, for example, students don't do as well on their homework or on tests if they're taking those tests in a hot environment and they don't have air conditioning. And sleep. And I said sleep is important. It's easy to kind of belittle sleep as being maybe insignificant, like just, oh, stop whining, get over it. But anybody who has had a prolonged period where they couldn't get enough sleep knows that you get really, really cranky. After a certain point, you can't function very well. You can't do your job very well. This is why you don't want doctors who are sleep deprived or truck drivers who are sleep deprived. It makes us less able to think about alternatives to a situation. So we might respond more instinctively in an aggressive fashion. And climate change interferes with behavior, not just because of heat, but also there are interesting ways in which the climate may no longer support normal social interaction. And this is something I've certainly heard about when it comes to kind of more polar regions, communities that are used to relying on frozen sea ice or frozen lakes or frozen ground to visit each other and get around in the winter on their snowmobiles have had a hard time doing that because the ice has been more unpredictable and the ground may thaw, so they can't use their snowmobiles, so they literally can't visit each other. It was not that many years ago where it got so hot in Phoenix that the planes couldn't take off. That's another example. We're used to flying in order to visit people. If we can't fly, that's going to affect our social relationships. And we know that social interaction is an incredibly important contributor to mental health. So these are some of the, there's a lot of the direct impacts I didn't talk about, just the extreme weather events and the heat, but those are the things we know most about. I want to say a little bit more about the indirect impacts, especially as I suggested earlier, displacement, economic status, and food insecurity. We know all of these are associated with poor mental health. So involuntary migration is very stressful. People get stressed as they're preparing to leave. They're stressed while they're leaving, especially, you read about some of the really dreadful experiences that migrants might have. And they're stressed when they get there. Often they're not well accepted by the community they're moving to. They also just don't feel as much at home. So they're at increased risk of psychosis. Even the second generation, I think, reflecting the fact that they still don't have this, the degree of familiarity and comfort and the strong social networks in their new place. So there's a lasting vulnerability to mental health problems. Economic insecurity, I think this is something we don't talk about nearly enough, that poverty is not just about, it's not just about difficulty in housing or difficulty feeding yourself. It's associated with increased depression and anxiety. And we can be pretty confident that's a causal relationship. In other words, it's not that depressed people are becoming poor, but that poverty leads to depression, because you can see if a new anti-poverty program is introduced or some other way of providing financial support to low-income populations, their rates of depression tend to go down. Whereas if those programs are taken away, depression goes up again. And I know some of you are very interested in development and developmental psychology. If you experience poverty as a child or prenatally, it's associated with adult mental illness and certainly risks to cognitive development. So I think we need to be mindful of the lasting impact of these kinds of experiences. Very similar kinds of findings with food insecurity. Food insecurity is associated with worse mental health, and that's independent of economic status. Again, if you experience food insecurity as a child, it may have impacts that are visible for adults. And interestingly, it's not just absolute insecurity, but relative insecurity. So it's partly this perception that I'm doing less well than other people that is associated with reduced well-being and reduced life satisfaction. So even more negative impacts on climate change, but I'm not done. Now I want to show you some different headlines about climate change, also all from this year. So more information about how hot things are getting, more information about superbugs, tipping points in the Amazon, the doomsday clock. All of this is really scary headlines, right? So here's a headline that kind of sums it up. Your crushing anxiety is normal. People are anxious. And this is not just because they're experiencing the effects of climate change. It's because they're thinking about climate change. They know that climate change is happening. So there's an anxiety associated with that perception. And this is something that I've just been paying attention to, for the fairly recently, the past 3 or 4 years, starting to listen to people talk about their anxiety. And here's some quotes I've heard from climate activists over the past few years. Those of you who are clinical, oriented towards clinical psychology or counseling psychology will sort of say, yes, my feelings had a physical manifestation. I stopped eating properly. I would freeze. These are some serious manifestations of anxiety, suggesting it's a real problem. So there is evidence, certainly people are reporting more and more anxiety about climate change. And you can see certainly increases in rates of concern and rates of people's perception that they are personally at risk from climate change. Anxiety is not necessarily a bad thing. It may be something we don't want to experience, but in many ways, anxiety has a function. It's like a warning sign that says, pay attention, there's something going on, you need to do something about it. If none of us were ever anxious, we would never address any of our problems, probably. So when people started to talk about climate anxiety a lot, again, like 4 years ago. One of my questions was, well, is that adaptive or is it dysfunctional? And I thought that was an important research question. So with my colleague, Brian Carazia, whose name is up there very small, we decided we needed to come up with a way of measuring climate anxiety or climate change anxiety that would define it as, is it a clinically significant problem? And we essentially said, consistent with the way psychologists usually think about clinical problems, it becomes a problem if it impairs your ability to function. So we looked at a variety of measures that kind of got at that sense of impairment. Does thinking about climate change interfere with your ability to think? So this is one item. Does thinking about climate change makes it difficult for me to concentrate? Does it interfere with your ability to regulate your own emotions? People who say, I can't stop crying about, or I'm thinking about climate change all the time. Does it interfere with your behavior? People who say, yes, thinking about climate change makes it hard for me to have fun, or it makes it hard for me to get my work done, or it's interfering with my ability to interact with my family. And so we developed this measure. We based it on existing clinical measures. And we found that the climate anxiety score was correlated with existing clinical measures of depression and anxiety. So again, I don't want to imply that climate anxiety is de facto a bad thing. It's not a sign that your mental health is impaired, but at a high level, it certainly can be a threat to your mental health. And since then, since we published this, which was in 2020, the measure has been used in a number of different countries, certainly including not just Western countries, but Asia, the Middle East, and the Philippines, consistently correlated with measures of anxiety and depression. So one question is, who is worried? And one answer is everyone is worried. Really, the majority of people in surveys are reporting that they're worried about climate change. And I like to stress that because this is something often people underestimate the extent to which other people are worried. They think, I'm worried, but nobody else is worried, so I'm not going to talk about it. And in fact, yes, the majority of people are worried and are perceiving personal risk. Young people seem to be more worried, although that's not true in every country. And it's not surprising that young people would be more worried. But also people who are at greater risk tend to be more worried. And again, that makes sense. That shows people are paying attention. So this is a study that I was fortunate to be involved in, where we actually looked at 10,000 people in 10 different countries around the world. And we asked them a number of questions, including how worried they were, and were their worries affecting their functioning. And so if you could look at the very top bar there, you say 45% of them said it was overall around the world, said it was affecting their functioning, which is a pretty high level. But you also see a wide variety of impacts of functioning and also on degrees of worry. So the ones that are more worried, you can see on here, for example, would be the Philippines, would be India, would be Brazil. Ones that are less worried are, the UK, the USA, and Finland. So you see that the countries that are really at risk, the countries that are already experiencing the effects of climate change, are ones where people are more worried. People in Finland are pretty calm. And women also, it turns out, are a little bit more worried. And that's not too surprising, because there's a lot of research showing that women tend to show higher levels of environmental kind of awareness and concern. Women also tend to talk about their emotions more, so maybe that's part of the reason. But you do find these statistically significant differences between men and women. And one other thing I'll point out from this graph is that sad, anxious, and afraid and powerless get really high ratings. Optimistic gets not very many people endorse that, but indifferent also not very many people endorsed. So people are thinking about it in addition to being worried about it. And there's not a lot of research yet that is able to predict climate anxiety, but this is a study that, again, was sort of fortuitous, an online study of climate anxiety using social media that happened to be done right before the heat dome. And so they're like, okay, we need to test this again right after the heat dome. And it turns out that climate anxiety rates had gone up. So not surprising, but kind of validating to know yes, the climate anxiety is responsive to actual experience. Why does it matter if people are anxious about climate change, especially if it's not a threat to mental health, which it sometimes is? So yes, there are the mental health effects, but also these sort of more general, broad negative thoughts. And these are items from that study of 10,000 people. Surprisingly high proportion were endorsing statements like humanity is doomed, or the future is frightening, or I'm hesitant to have children. So even if that doesn't, you don't want to overreact maybe to that kind of statement, but still, the fact that people are saying, yep, humanity is doomed, I think that's something we need to pay attention to. Political attitudes are involved. And again, same study, people said they felt betrayed by their government. Betrayed. What does that do if you're a young person, you feel betrayed by your government? It's certainly going to make you feel a little bit alienated, I think, from your society. And to the extent that they felt betrayed, they also reported more worry, more negative thoughts, and a greater impact on daily functioning. And this is something that is only just beginning to get some information to support, but planning for the future is probably affected by these concerns and anxiety. So in the 10,000 person survey, 39% were saying, I'm hesitant to have children. Now, a lot of those people are going to have children. This is not like 39% of people are going to stop having children, but even the fact that they're thinking about it, that their concerns about climate change are making them reconsider whether they want to have children. This is the Yale program on climate change communication, which is a really good source of just general public attitudes. They found that about 11% of Americans report that they are thinking about moving to avoid the impacts of global warming. And sure, that's a minority, but 11% of people are thinking about this when they're deciding where to live. That's a big deal. Financial planning. I don't have any data here, but I did see this tweet, so I copied it. You can read it. Yo millennials, have you been wondering if there's any point paying into a pension given the possibility that the world will be in utter chaos? And apparently got a whole lot of likes, a whole lot of retweets. Sorry, I'm trying not to trip here. She says, well, this blew up. So obviously a lot of people are thinking about it. And this, something I saw just last month, apparently it's becoming part of dating life. Climate change, and those of you who are doing online dating might want to pay attention. Climate change was the #1 concern for OkCupid daters. And so Tinder has this new campaign where you can say, I'm looking for someone to save the planet with. So there you go. So it is affecting the way people are thinking about their future. And this too is something that there's not much data on yet, but I want to broaden the discussion beyond anxiety and say we are experiencing very complex emotions when it comes to climate change. Sadness and grief is one of them. But anger is another one. And there are probably geographical differences in that. One thing you hear a lot is people in the global south who are already experiencing extreme effects of climate change and who did not do very much to cause it are feeling angry. They're feeling angry because they're dealing with this problem that they didn't cause. They're feeling angry because they feel abandoned by the people who did cause it. And then the idea of a sort of moral outrage. People in developed countries are more likely to feel guilt. I mentioned this, more likely to feel anger in the global south. There's a concept that was developed, particularly with regard to military veterans, talking about moral distress or moral injury. That sense that ethical norms are being violated. And Blanche Burley, who writes a lot about climate change, says people feel that their moral standing is sort of compromised by climate change. Like most people, a majority of people will say climate change is just kind of fundamentally wrong in some ways, that we shouldn't be able to have this impact on the planet. So moral injury, when the idea was developed, was really about witnessing or participating in unethical behavior. And it was looking at why veterans might be experiencing mental health problems associated with having, witnessed or participated in kind of war crimes, like killing people who perhaps didn't really deserve to die just because they were enemies, or just because you're caught up in the battle, or because your senior officer tells you to. It often involves disillusionment with an authority figure, and a feeling, again, of betrayal of what's right. So there's that sense of moral dissonance, like I'm supposed to be paying attention to these people who are in charge, and they are doing the wrong thing. And that's something a lot of people are feeling with regard to climate change as well. The people in charge are doing the wrong thing. And the consequences of that can be a personal loss of faith in that society, faith in that organization, a loss of a sense of meaning, what's sometimes called eudaimonic well-being. We want to believe that our lives have meaning and purpose, and if you feel that you're participating in something that violates your sense of moral rightness, it's hard to have that sense of purpose. So often that's self-blame, but people don't know how to stop participating, but they also don't completely let themselves off the hook. And there are consequences of feeling that kind of moral injury, associated with depression and anxiety, sometimes with self-harm, or with difficulty interacting with others. I want to emphasize that these mental health impacts don't hit everybody the same. So the impacts of climate change, the orange here, that's something that we're all experiencing, some of us to a greater or lesser extent, but how that affects mental health is also going to depend on vulnerability and on sources of support. Some groups are at greater risk. So clearly, some groups are geographically vulnerable. That's why you see those high levels of anxiety in places like the Philippines and India. People who have already experienced what it means to deal with the drought. People have already experienced what it means to have your homeland threatened. There are physiological vulnerabilities. Some people are more vulnerable to heat than others, for example. Older people, younger people, very young babies. People who are already suffering from mental illness tend to be more vulnerable, in part because a lot of psychoactive medications actually interfere with your body's ability to regulate its own temperature. People with disabilities are often left out of emergency planning kinds of programs. So if there's an announcement encouraging people to evacuate, maybe it will not be accessible to people who have hearing problems. Also, evacuation plans sometimes don't make provisions for people who might have a physical disability of some sort. Economic vulnerability is serious, and we know more and more about this, that lower income is associated with a greater exposure to hazards, including toxics in your environment, but also flooding and so on. People who are poorer have lower quality housing, in particular with, they're less likely to have air conditioning and less access to green space. And again, if maybe you were in a really hot place this summer, or maybe you read some of the articles, people in some of those cities that were really hot, like Phoenix, just waiting for the bus can be hazardous to your health. Richer parts of the city will have more trees planted, more green space, which tends to lower the temperature. People who are living in poorer parts of the city don't have the same green space. So in fact, that's associated. Sometimes the poorer parts of the city will be, like 3, 4, 5 degrees hotter than the richer parts of the city. Women and children, and I don't sort of apologize for combining those two categories, but they are both more vulnerable because in different ways, they have different physiological responses. So children whose systems, including their nervous systems, are still developing, you can have a much more profound impact on a developing system than one that's all developed. Women are more vulnerable when they're pregnant. So that's an issue. Women and children also have different roles, which tend in different ways to give them less power, less access to resources, as it says there. Also, children, obviously, they have to do what their parents or other guardians tell them to. Women have typically caretaking responsibilities, which might affect their ability to respond to climate change. And some of the ways in which women are more vulnerable, I highlight this in part because a lot of people resist the idea that we're differently vulnerable. They say, no, climate change is going to affect everyone the same, but it doesn't. So women are physiologically more affected by heat waves, as I mentioned, more vulnerable during pregnancy. They're often, especially in countries where gender roles are very divided, when there's financial insecurity, it's the women who drop out of school. It's the women who may face early marriages, and there have been studies that show that women are more likely to marry younger and marry less desirable spouses if the family is stressed. There's sexual violence, especially for women who are displaced. It's a real hazard. Many places, when food is limited, the men get first go at the food, so women are more likely to face that food insecurity. Domestic violence, which I referred to earlier. And women are more likely to die in climate change-related disasters, probably because they don't have access to the resources that might allow them to escape. Sometimes they might not know how to drive or not know how to read, or just not have access to the means of getting away. And women are more worried and showing more climate anxiety in a lot of places. So if you think about what makes climate conditions so stressful for people who aren't experiencing the direct effects, it's the unpredictability, it's the lack of control, and it's a threat to the things we value. So who values a natural environment? Indigenous peoples tend to have cultures that really stress their connection to specific environments. And research, especially in sort of the northern Canada kind of area, has found evidence that climate change is weakening social networks and leading to increased levels of substance abuse. It's also the case, however, that Indigenous peoples, it's not like things have been going great for them up to this point. So they are, in many ways, used to having to deal with changing circumstances. And increasingly, people are saying, hey, these communities might be able to teach us something about adaptation. So there's a lot of awareness that they have lessons that might benefit the larger society. Farmers also have a very strong relationship with the land, definitely an economic one, but if any of you are from farming families or if you talk to farmers, it's often an emotional connection as well. And suicide rates are really high for agricultural workers. Drought has led to, again, significant increases in suicide and mental distress among farmers. So I know you have all been hoping that I would start to talk about resilience. We're really, there's so much more to learn about this topic, but I do want to say a few words about what we know and thinking about not just promoting individual mental health, but also kind of collective well-being, because climate change is not an issue that can be addressed solely at the individual level. When we think about, as psychologists, how do we promote individual mental health? What's a kind of short-term response for that? We might talk about emotion-focused coping. So giving people skills for cognitive reframing, think about the situation differently, learn to step back and detach yourself from the situation, maybe stop, doom scrolling, step away from the news. Techniques for de-stressing, deep breathing, mindfulness, emotional skills, like notice when you're becoming overwhelmed, notice what are triggers for you. And these are all potentially useful, maybe cognitive reframing, not quite as much, but there's still a place for that because sometimes people do start kind of catastrophizing when it comes to climate change. The trouble with emotional focused coping is that it doesn't address the problem. So if you're just focusing on fixing your own emotions, the problem is just going to keep getting worse. So if we want to think about a long-term response, we also need to think about problem-focused coping, although there is some evidence that this is associated, in fact, with a negative emotions response. There are strengths that we can teach people. that will help them deal with their emotions while nevertheless not avoiding the problem, not denying the problem. And some of those focus on self-regulation, again, sort of monitoring your own emotions, stepping back when you're becoming overwhelmed, but also with connecting with other people. And this is something we know is really important, our social connections, and also enhancing your own sense of efficacy. You can form a connection not just with other people, but with the natural environment more generally. Some of my earlier work had to do a lot with that sense people have of themselves as being part of the natural world. And that is correlated with a sense of meaning, with a sense of self-efficacy, and with subjective well-being. But also taking action can also potentially promote resilience, because it gives people a sense of meaning and purpose and constructive hope. Constructive hope as opposed to hope based in denial. So hope can coexist with anxiety. And people who have studied hope talk about that sense of there are things that I'm willing to do, that I can do, and if everyone works together, we can do something about it. And so those are positive things, and not saying it's beyond my control. So being aware of your own ability to get engaged with the issue. And we need to think about how to allow people to create hope. We need to enable people to create a sense of hope, and self-efficacy. And we haven't always been doing a very good job at that, partly because I think society, especially in this country, although not exclusively, has not done a good job of supporting people's behavioral and emotional reactions to climate change. People talk about a feeling that there's a climate of silence, a sort of pluralistic ignorance where we really don't talk about the problem very much. And that's certainly been my experience. And when people do talk about their negative reactions to climate change, they may not feel like their emotions are validated. They don't feel supported. So we need to focus not just on helping people with their individual emotional reactions, but on providing support at a more collective level. The ways in which we interact with each other, the community programs that actually acknowledge that there's a problem and try to help people find ways to deal with it. Societal policies. Think about how much better you would feel if you felt confident that, yes, the government is on this, they're doing things, all of them, to try and address climate change. So I really want to just close by emphasizing that although as a psychologist, I'm certainly concerned with individual mental health and well-being, to really be resilient, we need to not just focus on individual resilience, but on societal resilience and societal change. And one of the first things is to just acknowledge the problem collectively and build that into our education systems, build that into the way we prepare for the future, design cities that are designed to function under changing climatic conditions, and also support mental health, which basically around the world is, under-acknowledged and underfunded. And that's my last slide. So thank you very much. And I look forward to questions. I'm not sure I caught everything you said, but you're talking about differences between countries based on their experience of the changing climate and the behavioral response. So I think there are several levels to answer that question on. One is just how are people affected by heat? And the studies that I've seen have actually found there was that question, like, are some countries sort of more adapted to it or more used to it? Or alternatively, are they more affected by it's getting hotter? So far, the research is suggesting pretty similar responses, even in different countries. So we need more research to kind of work that out. The other thing I would say is just about kind of international differences, that there's so many things going on there. So one of the distinctive things about the US is the degree of political polarization around climate change, which I don't believe you see in Nigeria. You see to some extent, in places like Brazil, but most people would say it's worst in the United States. So how people respond to climate change is partly determined by that sort of social context surrounding, are we taking this problem seriously? But then, of course, also what's the infrastructure in place? Like I don't know what proportion of Americans have air conditioning, but it's a higher proportion than Nigerians, probably. So So it's really complex, but all the more reason for us to be examining not just how people in this country are being affected, but how people in other countries are being affected. Yeah, so the question is, just to summarize, partly about how can we get our political leaders to take action when the incentives are within a political system, encourage them to only focus on the short term and essentially to kick the can down the road. And also maybe at the individual level, how do we bridge that gap between what we can individually do and the sense that collective action is needed? Yeah, and let me tell you the answer that will solve all of those problems. No, our political system is not very well. People have talked about climate change as the perfect storm, and that it's so easy to be ignored and to be pushed off. And on the one hand, I'm optimistic that it is harder and harder for people to ignore it, harder and harder for political leaders to completely ignore it. On the other hand, you see it still being used as a political football, as it were. So one side defines itself as not doing what the other side is doing. And so we're seeing some regression in the UK right now, for example, as the Conservative government is deciding they don't want to push for climate change targets as much. So that's not an answer. That's just, yes, this is a serious problem. There's a lot of research on climate change communication, and two things that seem to be, multiple things. One is to try and focus on things that everybody can support, everyone can agree on, and everybody likes health. Everybody thinks health is a good thing. So if we emphasize the health impacts, that tends to get more support and interest across the political spectrum than talking about some of the other kinds of impacts. Also, encouraging people to think about the future. And, we all sometimes think about the future and sometimes don't, but you can say to people, what would you like your legacy to be? Or what do you think the world of your grandchildren will look like? And that does increase people's willingness or tendency to think about the future on average. And when they are thinking about the future, they're more willing to acknowledge the reality of climate change. So whether we can do that with their political leaders, I don't know, but also personal stories. And sometimes it might just be like, let's not use the word climate change and let's start focusing on energy independence, for example, or focus on how many lives would be saved if we reduced our use of fossil fuels, even if climate change weren't happening, because so many people die because of air pollution. So sometimes you might make your strongest case by ignoring the climate change and talking and focusing on something that everyone can agree on. Sure, and you all in the audience, you know this. We hear a lot of people saying, "Oh, essentially, good thing the young people are stepping up. Good thing they're the ones who are becoming activists, and they're going to solve this problem." And you even do hear older people say, "Well, not my problem. I'll be dead." And that sounds like a terrible thing to say, but people are saying it. So I do think the burden is on young adults right now, because for that practical, because the older generations have failed, and because it's going to be a fact of life. There is evidence that I think for one reason that younger generation, people of my generation, people who are middle-aged or older, had to come to awareness of climate change. It wasn't something we were sort of born thinking about. People who are in their 20s right now, were born sort of aware of climate change. It was already a thing. So that cognitive barrier isn't in the way. So you're sort of used to this as a reality. And that's a good thing. I'm sorry that you're going to have to deal with it, but there are still a lot of older people, like Bill McKibben has this new, I can't remember what he calls his group of older people worried about climate change, but so it's not all about the young people, but there is that uneven burden of responsibility. And again, younger generations are just having to factor this into their decision-making in a way that older generations didn't. So, but come together, at least you have, I think, that greater sense of collective awareness and willingness to change. And actually, I'll say this because it's a little bit more positive. Working together on an issue that you think is really important can be a profoundly positive experience. And you hear that these days for people who were like working on civil rights movement back in the 60s. That just, it was a very, scary time, but it was also a really powerful time to come together and feel like you were making a difference. And climate scientists these days will say they feel scared, they feel frustrated, but they also feel proud that they are able to work on an issue that that matters so much. So there is a potential for positive emotions and positive experiences associated with coming together to work on this issue. And I also fundamentally believe addressing climate change will make some other changes that it will have benefits. It will have what are called co-benefits often. So it's not just avoiding the problem, it's creating a society that's better functioning.
I was actually thinking a little bit about that study where you could look before and after and see the increase in climate anxiety. And I wondered if anybody is thinking about doing sort of pre-post assessment after, say, like a climate action conference or something like that, where people get an opportunity to come together and talk about solutions and action and so on, and then measuring how people are feeling after that versus before, and seeing if we get the lift from that kind of positive action-based.
Yeah, absolutely. So the question is, can we compare, do pre-tests and post-tests to see if coming together to at a climate change conference or to talk about climate change action, if that actually reduces anxiety. I strongly encourage somebody in this room to do that research. I know people are thinking about, looking at what kinds of things can affect climate anxiety. And there's a few, not many, but a few studies that have suggested that learning more can actually reduce your anxiety. So in contrast to what some people might say, which is, oh, it's the media telling us about climate change, that's what's making us afraid. Getting more accurate information about climate change does seem to reduce anxiety a little bit, probably because it makes you feel a little bit more in control. It's not like this scary, terrible thing that you don't really understand. You have a little better sense of, well, exactly what's going on. And is the world going to burn up, in 2040? No, probably not, kind of thing. So the question is about the impact of support groups where people essentially share their feelings about climate change. And that does seem to be a good idea. And one reason is, one thing that people who are talking to therapists about their anxiety often talk about the lack of validation, that they don't feel that other people support or recognize their emotions. So a very useful thing is just to feel that your emotions are reasonable. You're not ridiculous for being worried. You're not, crazy for being worried. Your sense of reality is not impaired. And that just sense of shared feeling provides its own level of support. So I think that that would be a great thing. So the question is, given the positive effect that trees have both on absorbent taking up carbon and on our mental health, what about all these wildfires that are burning down all the trees? Is that a fair summary, or did I miss something? Yeah. So yeah, bad thing. But it raises the whole complicated question of trees are sometimes presented as like, oh, here's all we need to do, plant 1 billion trees, plant 1 trillion trees. Trees are good. Trees poorly planted might actually increase wildfires if you plant the wrong kind of tree or plant them in the wrong kind of place and make them sort of more vulnerable to burning down. So we need trees, but we need to be thoughtful about the species that we're planting, and we need to be thoughtful about taking care of it after it's planted to get those benefits of, to both, those ecological and psychological benefits because of the potential. I mean, if psychologically, if the tree is gone, it's just sort of an absence of benefit. But ecologically, if the tree burns up, it definitely has the potential for a net negative impact. Yeah, so the question is, are people in high-income communities essentially less mindful about the hazards associated with the changing climate? And it's an interesting question because there's often a myth that you have to be privileged to care about the environment. But in fact, as you point out from the East Palestine train wreck, poorer people tend to be more vulnerable, and they know generally that they're more vulnerable. So in fact, you do tend to see high levels of concern. Again, when it just becomes about heat. And I think one of the reasons the California wildfires had such a big impact is like suddenly these very privileged people living in rich areas were also threatened by the impacts of climate change. So I think those are both true, that lower income people are more aware of their own vulnerability. So higher income people might have been more blasé, just like, you know, they're blasé about a lot of things because they know they can escape it. But I do think that it will change because there are ways in which we can't, even your money can't protect you as the climate continues to change.
Yeah, we're gonna stop us there. Thank you all so much. I recognize it's 2:55. A lot of us have classes to go to, but thank you.